Hello and welcome to Creating a Human Rights Culture, which aims to promote a lived awareness of the interdependency and indivisibility of human rights principles in our minds, hearts, and bodies, that is, dragged into our everyday lives. What, after all, is freedom of speech to a person who is homeless and lives in a world at war? Therefore, it is dedicated ultimately to the application of the Human Rights Triptych, which in brief consists of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights at its center, the conventions, that is, international treaties on the right, and implementation measures on the left. Hello, I'm Joseph Ronca, and today I'd like to talk about what's coming up, a major day to commemorate the world's indigenous peoples. It's on August 9th. And I'm here with my guest, Rolf Schilling. All right. And I'm going to read a declaration on the rights of indigenous people, parts of it. And I'm also going to read what could be called the Western Massachusetts Declaration to commemorate August 9th as Indigenous Peoples Day, the world's Indigenous Peoples Day. But first, a few words. I do want to thank the town of Amherst for declaring the second Monday of October as Indigenous Peoples Day. They did it at a town meeting back on May 2nd, 2016. Actually, I thought the declaration was pretty good. We discussed it. And it spoke about and acknowledged the genocide against indigenous people, beginning with Columbus, whose diaries asserted, quote, his desire to enslave the native populations, which ultimately resulted, and this is according to the declaration by Amherst, the systematic policies of slavery and extermination of native populations by European colonizers. The town also acknowledged that the culture of Native American people is one to be promoted. Their history is rich, diverse, and worthy of celebration. And that's why you're here. Now, whereas that declaration was certainly a good thing, and it's indicative of progress toward having a culture of human rights for every person everywhere, this show is to talk about and get support for August 9th, which the United Nations has declared the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples. Keeping in mind the words of Reverend Dr., or is it Dr. Reverend, I always get that confused, Martin Luther King, that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. August 9th is to bring attention to issues that Indigenous peoples face, such as, and we discussed, the suicide rates that are roughly 10 times higher than their white counterparts, alcoholism and diabetes rates roughly 5 to 7 times higher, estimates, their bodies and their circulatory systems that are just not used to European elixirs and food, let alone the fact that often they are the first victims of climate change and other environmental disasters, as they tend to live nearer to the oceans and the seas. I also recall well how when I lived in Alaska, I was told of dentists that would merely put the film, X-ray film, in an Eskimo's, I don't know if we're supposed to say Eskimo, I'll say Inupiat, okay, Inupiat's mouth, to get an X-ray of his teeth, as he was already radioactive from the atomic tests from Nevada, which emitted radioactive particles into the atmosphere, which eventually landed on the lichen, which the caribou ate, and finally, the unsuspecting Inupiat. There were a lot of stories up there. This is one reason I'm doing this. What I saw up there was amazing, even in regards to alcoholism. There's a thing called, they're just not used to it. There's a thing called idiosyncratic intoxication. It's like taking arsenic. They might take a drink or two and they start shaking. And this one guy, he had literally his hand looked like fish scales. He drank a 6-pack, wake up in the morning, it looks like fish scales. And they're just not used to this European kind of oppression. I'll just finish, okay? Well, you want to make a point, go ahead.
Well, no, it just, I have European blood also, but a lot of people don't have any, just genetically, and it can't tolerate the alcohol. I've seen it. I've seen people have a drink, indigenous people have a drink, and they go all patchy colored and this and that. And,
Yeah.
But socially, there's a lot of pressure to drink, even if you can't tolerate it.
Yes, it's definitely a serious issue.
And I don't tolerate it either very well.
I don't either,
So
actually.
I can't.
But also, we must remember that their language and culture is dying. And when an elder dies, it's almost like an entire library is lost. And you're an elder, and this is one thing we're doing here to exploit you for your knowledge. Now, previously, the town of Amherst has declared October 17th as the International Day to Eradicate Extreme Poverty, and March 21st as the International Day to Eradicate Racism, both in accordance with the United Nations proclamations. August 9th is to commemorate the world's indigenous peoples, and this is to continue with what arguably can be called a tradition. I did contact the town manager's office. Actually, I contacted them about a week ago, and I should have done this months ago. There's so much time in the day.
Right.
And they told me that they had already declared the first Monday of October as an Indigenous Peoples Day. And in brief, they didn't appear that interested at this point, but I did get a message from a Matthew, I don't forget his last name, he's head of the Human Rights Commission, and he expressed interest. And he's going to put this declaration that we're going to talk about on Facebook, and maybe next year we could think about these things and get up some momentum. Anyway, so here we are. You, my friend, are one of the last surviving speakers of Nipmuc and a strong advocate of Indigenous rights. What I was thinking of doing today is to talk about the select principles of the Declaration of the World's Indigenous Peoples, which I have here, and you can access on the internet. I believe they'll give you the site, and then sign it or pass it on, do whatever you want with it.
Please sign it.
And what?
Please sign it.
Yeah, please sign it. We would like all municipalities to sign it and endorse it, and get some momentum going for Indigenous peoples' rights. By the way, does people know what "by the way" is? I should say BTW? I don't know. BTW, we will have a reading of the Declaration of August 9th as the International Day of Indigenous Peoples for the municipalities in Western Mass, whatever you want to do. And we'll also have a declaration of the document, reading of the declaration of the document I mentioned before. They call it UN DRIP. I think the acronyms are kind of weird, but it's called the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. We're going to have a reading of it at Puffer's Pond, August 9th at 7 o'clock. So it'd be great to have you. And who knows, we might have some dancing a little, we don't know, but hey, it's Puffer's Pond. You want to bring your bathing suit, do whatever you want. Come one, come all. So, any comments right now?
I'm very happy that that Amherst and the Office of Human Rights is taking an interest and is going to try to help develop an event for next year. And it shows that this is a process. We have to be patient, but it's also an emergency, so we have to be active. The state of Indigenous peoples in the world is an emergency situation. You don't have to leave Massachusetts to show why. Nipmuc is an endangered language. It's one of the most endangered languages in the world. Awa people of Brazil are inches away from physical extinction. They're being picked off by ranchers. Last I heard, there were less than 300 of these people. They're sitting in an enclave surrounded of their own land, a morsel surrounded by dangers to their physical existence and no real relief. And of course, they're an unrepresented nation, which UN also addresses, like the Hmong
Yes.
have been a major topic since they are a large group of people spanning many nations, but are completely unrepresented. So the Nipmuc are also non-represented people in the sense that the Nipmuc are only recognized by the state of Massachusetts, and there are historically 5 divisions, but we don't enjoy recognition of all 5 divisions under any level. We don't enjoy federal recognition. Many Nipmuc or many people who have Nipmuc descent are not enrolled. And we have parallel situations with Pokanoket and Massachusetts and everybody except for the Wampanoag in this state who happen to, the Mashpee and Laquina, happen to enjoy federal recognition. So it shows you that actual recognition, getting a little bit of justice, is the exception to the rule, even here, where the rule is extinction by dictum or extinction by paper, then which is followed by cultural extinction, and then physical dissolution in the sense that nobody will recognize you for who you are. So it happens that I had to work hard to learn to speak Nipmuc, and I purposely did it at the urging of my great aunt because she was very aware of the endangerment of the language with extinction. And we were both aware, I'm more Mohawk than Nipmuc, but many more people speak Mohawk, which is even so a threatened language. So it gives you a sort of lens to look at this. But the importance, I think, of World Indigenous Day is that, as indigenous nations within colonial nations need to band together because they cannot assert anything for their survival without grouping together. And the nations of the world need to band together. That's why we have a UN, so that we can gain justice within a context of superpower spheres of influence. Indigenous people across the world need to recognize that we essentially haven't got a ghost of a chance unless we come all together and assert our rights as human beings before the UN, who is basically the one body in this world that is receptive and nurturing for whatever shortcomings that people may argue. It is the one body in the world that is receptive and nurturing to unrepresented nations and indigenous peoples everywhere. So it's a no-brainer. We need to come together around one point and hold hands so that we can survive all these
on that
indigenous.
account, I just want to say that it was very controversial at the United Nations to refer to indigenous peoples as indigenous people, because they're all one, or indigenous peoples. And what they did was they decided to put the S on there, but they said when we say that, just let's know they're all one also. So, I mean, that's the way things go at the UN.
Well, we all are all one, so it'd be
It's one
ideally
human
we
family
could
anyway. Yeah.
Ideally we wouldn't need to have these discussions because everybody would be regarded as your brother and sister and aunt and uncle, and we would afford each other the kind of considerations we would our family, which would hopefully we love our family.
Okay.
But ideally we wouldn't need to worry about unevenness in the world, but as things are. And I think it's unfortunate we have to worry about whether to have an S or not. But as long as we, like you say, as long as we understand, I think we're in an okay place.
What it's about. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for those introductory words. I just want to give a little history of the, first of all, I don't know, maybe we should call this the Western Massachusetts Declaration of August 9th, or just a declaration. Just say a few words what's in it, and then I'd like to have your opinion. And like you said before, have people sign it and pass it around to your municipalities or the state or even the United States for that matter. So and we had drafted this together. So I think our viewers ought to know that it was on December 23rd, 1994, that the UN General Assembly decided that the International Day of the World's Indigenous People would be August 9th of every year. That day marked the first meeting in 1982 of the UN Working Group on Indigenous Populations and the Subcommission on the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights. It's kind of weird. The UN came about in 1945, let me see, 55, 65. This is close to 40 years later. That's just the way things go. I do know that the 500th anniversary of the landing of Columbus in 1992 at the UN was a total thud. Duh, I couldn't imagine why. And the coalition that was pretty much against it, was very interesting, was basically African nations and indigenous people, of course, but the African nations seemed a lot more into it. So it was kind of a thud. And
They also,
but
I
it
think,
sort
have a
of
little
led
more
to
pull.
this. What?
They also have a little more pull.
And they have more pull.
With a couple of billion people and a lot of oil.
That's what it came down to. Yeah, exactly. Okay, and I just want to let the viewers know, and then back in 1993, the United Nations declared that year the International Year of World's Indigenous Peoples, and then they had 2 international decades of indigenous people. The second one ended in 2014. I don't know what they're doing now, but it ended then, so maybe people are sort of trying to build on the momentum. And now they adopted, the UN General Assembly adopted it was a non-binding, but nevertheless aspirational document, okay? Aspirational, from the Latin spirum, which means into the foundations, okay, all right? So called UN DRIP, Universal, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. It was adopted on September 13th, 2007 by the General Assembly. There were 4 abstentions. We were one of them, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. And guess what, viewers? The last government to sign on, because they eventually signed on, was the United States. Okay, so just something to keep in mind. And I go to the UN, I just have to say, when I speak with some indigenous people there, they say, you know, what is it about us? People don't like us. Just telling you what I hear.
Yeah,
okay,
I've heard that too.
There's an estimated 370 million indigenous people in the world. They live across 90 countries. They make up less than 5% of the world's population, but they account for 15% of the poorest. They speak an overwhelming majority of the world's estimated 7,000 languages, and they represent 5,000 different cultures. So this is one of the reasons that we need to be interested. I guess it is a little narcissistic. So we don't want to lose your knowledge. So we have to appropriate your knowledge or something. I don't know,
well,
but
at least
it's
that's
just
a
something to
premise.
think about. What?
It's a premise putting forth, I think, trying to attract people's sympathy. And I think it also is fitting to, or even more important, and maybe directly hitting on people's lives in a way that might mean something to them, to take note of the fact that many of the world's major life-saving medicines come to us from indigenous people, and largely from one continent, actually, or two, but very heavily falling on South America. Curare, which is a drug that has enabled surgery that wasn't possible before its existence. A lot of thoracic surgery depends on, or did depend on curare, and allowed leaps in medicine and many healthy lives to be saved. You know, many people who could have surgery and then lead a productive, healthy life. Try to say in English, and I can't. quinine.
Quinine, yeah.
Again, the cinchona tree, and a number of other medicines, but also aspirin.
Aspirin?
Et cetera.
I thought that was a German thing, no? Was it?
Oh, the
Yeah.
Germans purified it, but Native Americans have long used it, and it was quickly picked up by colonials when they got here. But the Germans basically invented inorganic chemistry, so to speak. The first inorganic dyes and such things. So the first truly, you can't say things are truly synthetic, because after all, we're just taking stuff that's here and remixing it. And as somebody who's actual degrees in biochemistry, I sort of reject the idea that we invent anything. But the first quote-unquote synthetics were made in Germany, and Germany's always been way ahead of the world on chemistry, but China's coming up close on their heels now. Yeah, so they refined almost all the first refined medicines, and the first inorganic inks and on like this all come from Germany. And also the first weapons, the chemical weapons of war. Well, strictly chemical, that is to say. But anyway, but we do derive a lot of life-saving medicines from indigenous people, and continue to do so. Universities around the world have spent quite a bit of money on sending some very privileged individuals from their societies to go to very underprivileged citizens of other societies and collect their intellectual property, which was brought back to places like Harvard by very famous people like Schulze, and who offered a shaman $2 and told him that's a lot of money, which is all brought up in, and then on Brazo del Serpiente, with the Embrace of the Serpent, which is a movie that's based on this whole dynamic and that specific, the biography of these two specific individuals, Evan something Schultes, who's a ethnographer for, I believe, Harvard, and he's, quote unquote, founding father of ethnobotany, one of them, and but his relationship with indigenous people speaks to how it goes. $2 is not a lot of money, the market value of things like curare and quinine and things like this are in the billions. And the UN itself, and I wish I could quote this source, but the UN itself placed the market value of indigenous intellectual property, mostly medicines and things like this, but sometimes also things like rubber, on which the Maya made sacred game balls with. They placed, I think, about 70 billion annually, out of which the indigenous people from whom this property was obtained get about 1/17,000th of 1%.
This is part one, and now that I've given a history of the, whatever you want to call it, the Western Declaration, and spoken about some of the issues facing indigenous people that you elaborated upon, what I would like to do in part two, and by the way, we urge our viewers here, through open discussion, debate, creative dialogue, and direct, non-violent social action conducive of human dignity, and in solidarity with all oppressed people throughout the world, toward implementation of human rights documents, particularly in the case of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, whose principles include, but are not limited to, part two. I'd like to talk about some of the principles of UN DRIP and get your viewpoint.
Thank you.
And thank you. Okay. Bye for now.